Her Stories Across the Moors by William Fryer Harvey. It was really most unfortunate. Peggy had a temperature of nearly 100, a pain in her side, and Mrs. Workington Bancroft knew that it was appendicitis. Yes, but there was no one whom she could send for the doctor. James had gone with a jaunting car to meet her husband, who had at last managed to get away for a week's shooting. Adolphe, well, she had sent him to the Evershams only a half-hour before with a note for Lady Eva. The cook could not manage to walk, even if dinner could be served without her. And Kate, Kate, as usual, was not to be trusted. So there remained Miss Craig. "Of course, you must see that Peggy is really ill," said she, as the governess came into the room in answer to her summons. "The difficulty is that there is absolutely no one whom I can send for the doctor." Mrs. Workington Bancroft paused. She was always willing that those beneath her should have the privilege of offering their services, which it was her right to command of them. "So perhaps, Miss Craig," she went on, "perhaps you would not mind walking over to the Tebbets farm. I hear there's a Liverpool doctor staying there at the farm, and of course I know nothing about him, but we must take the risk. I expect he'll be only too glad to be earning something for this holiday. It's nearly 4 miles, I know, and I'd never dream of asking if it was not that I dread the appendicitis so." "Very well," said Miss Craig. "I suppose I must go, but I don't know the way, Mrs. Bancroft." "Oh, you can't miss it," said Mrs. Workington Bancroft, in her anxiety temporarily forgiving the obvious unwillingness of her governess's consent. "You follow the road across the moor for 2 miles until you come to Redman's Cross. You turn to the left there, you follow a rough path that leads through a lark plantation, and from Tebbets farm lies just below you in the valley. Oh, and take Pontiff with you," she added as the girl left the room. "There's absolutely nothing to be afraid of, but I expect you'll feel happier with the dog." "Nothing to be afraid of," she says. "Does anyone know what lies at crossroads? What magic, what darkness, what things and power lies at crossroads, such as Redman's Cross?" I do. I suspect you do, too. Well, anyway. "Well, miss," said the cook, when Miss Craig went into the kitchen to get her boots, which had been drying by the fire. "Of course she knows best, but I don't think it's right after all that's happened for the mistress to be sending you, Miss Craig, out across the moors on a night like this. I don't think it's right at all. It's not as if the doctor could do anything for Miss Margaret if you do bring him. Every child's like that once in a while. You know he'll only say put her to bed, and she's there already in bed, isn't she?" "I don't see what there is to be afraid of, cook," said Miss Craig as she laced her boots. "Nothing to be afraid of at all. I mean, unless you believe in ghosts." "Well, I'm not so sure about that. Anyhow, I don't like sleeping in a bed where the sheets are too short for you to pull them over your head. But don't you be frightened, Miss Craig. It's my belief that their bark is worse than their bite, them ghosts." But though Miss Craig amused herself for some minutes by trying to imagine the bark of a ghost, a thing altogether different from the classical ghostly bark, she did not feel entirely at her ease either. Yes, Miss Craig was, shall we say, naturally nervous, and living as she did in the hinterland of the servants' halls, while she had heard, as perhaps you and I have, the vague details of true stories that were only myths in the drawing room. The very name of Redman's Cross sent a shiver through her. It must have been that crossroads. It must have been that place right there where the horrid murder was committed. Miss Craig had forgotten the tale, but she remembered the name. At any rate, her first disaster came soon enough. Pontiff, the dog, who was naturally slow-witted, took more than 5 minutes to find out that it was only the governess he was escorting. But once that discovery had been made, yes, the trusty dog promptly turned tail, paying not the slightest heed to Miss Craig's feeble whistle. And then to add to Miss Craig's discomfort, the rain came. not in heavy drops, not in slimy toads, but in driving sheets of thin spray that blotted out what few landmarks there were upon the moors. Yes, they were the very kind at Tebbett's farm. The doctor had gone back to Liverpool the day before, but Mrs. Tebbett had given her hot milk and turf cakes, and offered a reluctant son to show Miss Craig a shorter path on the moor that avoided the larch wood. Now this youth was a monosyllabic youth. Funny that word has so many syllables, isn't it? But his presence was cheering, at least, to Miss Craig, and Miss Craig felt the night doubly black when this youth left her at the last gate. Miss Craig trudged on wearily, though. Starcrosser, you're welcome, late or early. Well, in fact, Starcrosser, with a name like that, you could be a wizard, and wizards are never late nor early. They always arrive exactly when they expect to, isn't it? Something like that. Well, as I say, Miss Craig trudged on wearily across the moors by herself now. Her thoughts had already gone back to the almost exhausted theme of the bark of ghosts, when she heard steps on the road behind her that were at least material. Next minute, the figure of a man appeared. Miss Craig was relieved to see that the stranger was a clergyman. He raised his hat. I believe we're both going in the same direction. Perhaps I may have the pleasure of escorting you. She thanked him. Well, it is rather weird at night here, and what with all the tales of ghosts and bogies that one hears from the country people, I've ended up being half afraid myself.
Ma'am, I can understand your nervousness, especially on a night like this one. I used at one time to feel the same. For my work often meant lonely walks across the moor to farms which were only reached by rough tracks, difficult enough to find even in the daytime.
And in all your travels, you never saw anything to frighten you, nothing immaterial, I mean.
Well, I can't really say that I did, ma'am, but I had an experience 11 years ago which served as the turning point of my life. And since you seem to be now in much the same state of mind as I was then in, I will tell it to you. The time of the year was late September. I'd been over to Westendale to see an old woman who was dying, and then just as I was about to start on my way home, well, word came to me of another of my parishioners who had been suddenly taken ill only that morning. It was after, 7, perhaps, when I at last started. A farmer saw me on my way, turning back when I reached the moor road. The sunset the previous evening had been one of the most lovely I ever remembered seeing. The whole vault of heaven had been scattered with flakes of white cloud, tipped with rosy pink like the strewn petals of a full-blown rose. Yes, but, well, as it will, night changed all that. The sky was an absolutely dull slate color, except in one corner of the west where a thin rift showed the last saffron tint of the southern sunset. As I walked, stiff and footsore, my spirits sank. It must have been the marked contrast between the two evenings. The one so lovely, so full of promise. The corn was still out in the fields spoiling for fine weather. And the other, so gloomy, so sad with all the dead weight of autumn and winter days to come. And then, the added to this sense of heavy depression came another different feeling which I surprised myself at recognizing as fear. I did not know why I was afraid. The moors lay on either side of me, unbroken except for a straggling line of turf shooting butts, but that stood within a stone's throw of the road. The only sound I had heard for the last half hour was the cry of the startled grouse. Go back, go back, go back. And yet the feeling of fear, it was there, affecting a low center of my brain through some little used physical channel, perhaps. At any rate, I buttoned my coat closer, and I tried to divert my thoughts by thinking of next Sunday's sermon. I had chosen to preach on Job. There is much in the old-fashioned notion of the book, apart from all the subtleties of the higher criticism that appeal to country people, the loss of herds and crops, the breakup of the family. I would not have dared to speak had I not been a farmer myself. My own glebe land had been flooded 3 weeks before. I suppose I stood to lose as much as any man in the parish. As I walked along the road, repeating to myself the first chapter of the book, I stopped alone at the 12th verse. And the Lord said unto Satan, Behold all that is in thy power. Alone, the darkness, the thought of the bad harvest, and that's an awful thought in these valleys, vanished. I seemed to gaze into an ocean of infinite darkness. I'd often used with the Sunday glibness of the tired priest whose duty it is to preach 3 sermons in one day, the old simile of the chessboard. God and the devil were players. We were helping one side or the other. Yes, but until that night I had not thought of the possibility of my being only a pawn in that game, that God might throw away the game. He might throw me away, that the game might be won. I had reached the place where we are now, miss, right here. This same spot. I remember it by that rough stone water trough. When a man suddenly jumped up from the roadside, he'd been seated on a heap of broken road metal. Which way you going, governor, huh? I knew from the way he spoke the man was a stranger. The many at this time of year who come up from the south, tramping northwards with the ripening corn, I told him my destination. Yeah, we'll go along together, then we will. And together we'll go, yeah. It was too dark to see much of the man's face, but what little I made out was coarse and brutal. And then he began the half-menacing whine I knew so well. He had trampled for miles that day. He had had no food since breakfast, and that was only a crust. Yeah, governor, give us a copper, won't you? Give us a copper. It's only for the night's lodging, governor. Give it. He was whittling away with a big clasp knife at an ash stake he had taken from some hedge or other. The clergyman broke off there. Are those the lights of your house, miss? Oh, we are nearer than I expected. But I shall have time to finish my story for you, miss. Yes, I think I will. For when I finish my story, you can run home in a couple of minutes, and I don't want to be frightened when you're out on the moors again. At any rate, as the man talked, he seemed to have stepped out of the very background of my thoughts, his sordid tale with the sad lies that hid a far side of truth. He asked me the time. It was 5 minutes to 9. As I replaced my watch, I glanced at his face. His teeth were clenched. There was something in the gleam of his eyes that told me at once his purpose. Ma'am, have you ever known how long a second is? Of a third of a second. I stood there facing that man, that menace, filled with an overwhelming pity for myself and for him. And then without a word of warning, he was upon me. I felt nothing. A flash of lightning ran down my spine. I heard the dull crash of the ash stake, and then a very gentle patter, like the sound of a far-distant stream. For a minute I lay in perfect happiness, watching the lights of the house as they increased in number until the whole heaven shone with twinkling lamps. Oh, alas, I could not have had a more painless death. Miss Craig looked up. The man was gone, and she was alone on the moor. She ran to the house, her teeth chattering. She ran to the solid shadow that crossed and recrossed the kitchen blinds. As Miss Craig entered the hall, the clock on the stairs struck the hour. It was 9 o'clock. Oh, that's across the moors. At least he was a friendly ghost, eh? As I say, in a couple of weeks, we'll be doing a live story from a live, real-world haunted house with a real-world audience joining us in the virtual worlds. It'll be fun. So this next story is also a story of a haunted house. At least that's what I think it's about. It's called The Coat. I'm quite aware that the other fellows in the office regard me as something of an oddity, being a strange bird. Well, of course, a man who happens to be of a studious disposition, who dislikes noise, prefers his own company to that of the empty-headed companions, moving furniture about their offices and making nasty noises and jabbering as they will. Yes, well... And moreover, as a man who is compelled by defective vision to wear thick glasses is always liable to be thus misjudged by the inferior minds around him. Ordinarily, I treat the opinion of my colleagues with the contempt it deserves. But at this particular moment, I was beginning to think that perhaps, after all, there might be something to be said for their view. For though I might still repudiate the strange bird part of the business, undoubtedly I was an ass. I was a first-class chump. Otherwise, I would have been spending my holidays in a nice, comfortable way with the rest of the normal world, listening to the Perraults or winking at the girls on the promenade of some seaside resort at home. Instead of having elected, as I did, to set out alone on this idiotic push-bike tour of a little-known part of France. Drenched, hungry, and lost, a stranger in a strange land, dispiritedly pushing before me a heavy-laden bicycle with a gashed tire. Such was the present result of my asinine choice. Welcome, Applestack. Good to see you. Starcrosser, rather, sorry. I already said to welcome to you. Good, it's good to see you. Who else popped in when I wasn't looking? Oh, Kylie. Hello, Talia, Serene. Welcome. Anyway, the storm had overtaken me from miles from anywhere. On a wild road over a spur of the Vosges. For nearly 2 hours I had trudged through the pelting rain without encountering a living soul or at least a sign of some human habitation. And then at long last, rounding a bend, I glimpsed just ahead of me the chimney pots and gables of a fair-sized house. It was a lonely, desolate-looking place standing amid a clump of trees a little way back from the road, and somehow even at a distance did not convey a very inviting impression. Nevertheless, in that wilderness, it was a welcome enough sight, and in the hope of finding temporary shelter and possibly a little badly needed refreshment, I quickened my pace towards it. 200 yards brought me to the entrance gates, and here I suffered a grievous disappointment. For the roofless porter's lodge, the dilapidated old gates hanging askew on their hinges, and the overgrown drive beyond, plainly indicated that this place was no longer inhabited. I speedily comforted myself, however, with the reflection that in the circumstances even a deserted house was not to be despised as refuge. So once under cover of some kind, I might make shift to wring out my drenched clothing, repair my damaged mount, and without further ado, I pushed my bicycle up the long, neglected drive, and I reached the terrace in front of the house itself. It proved to be an old chateau, half smothered in creepers and vines that had long gone wild, and judging by the carved stone coat of arms over the main entrance, had once been occupied by a person of some quality. Mounted on a pedestal on either side of the iron-studded front door stood a rusty carronade, trophies probably of some long-forgotten war in which the former occupier had played a part. Most of the windows had been boarded up. It was evident that this place had stood empty for many, many years. So I tried the front door. To my surprise, it was unfastened. A firm thrust from my shoulder sent it creaking grudgingly back on its hinges. My nostrils, as I stepped into the dim, wide hall, were at once assailed by the stale, disagreeable odor of rotting woodwork and mouldy hangings and carpet. For a moment or two I stood peering uncertainly about me, with the slight feeling of eeriness that one usually experiences when entering an old and empty house. Facing me was a broad staircase with a long stained-glass window, almost opaque with dirt and cobwebs at its head. I mounted the stairs, and throwing open the first door at hand, I found myself looking into a spacious, handsomely furnished room that had evidently once been the chief apartment of that house, though long neglect and disuse had now reduced it to a sorry state indeed. The ornate cornice hung here and there in strips, and in one corner the plaster of the ceiling had come down altogether. Green mold covered the 18th century furniture. Curtains and draperies hung in tatters, and one half of the beautiful old Persian carpet, from a point near the door right across to the fireplace, was overspread by an evil-smelling bright orange fungus. It's okay, you can say ooh here if you want to. The fireplace gave me an idea, though. Could I but find fuel, I might light a fire. I might make myself a hot drink and get my clothes properly dried. A little searching in the outbuildings discovered a sufficient quantity of old sticks to serve my purpose, and with a bundle of them under my coat, I re-entered the house and briskly made my way upstairs again. But on the threshold of the big room, without quite knowing why, I suddenly checked myself. It was as though my legs, of their own volition, had all at once become reluctant to carry me farther into that apartment, as if something quite outside of me were urging me to turn about and retreat. I laid the sticks down at my feet, and for a moment or two stood there uncertainly in the doorway. I was beginning to sense some subtle suggestion of danger in the atmosphere of this place. Everything was apparently just as I had left it, yet I had an uneasy sort of feeling that during my absence, something evil had entered that room. I am neither a nervous nor a superstitious person, yet I found myself a moment later rather shamefacedly picking up my sticks and moving back towards the head of the stairs. Actually, it was not so much fear as a vague, precautionary sense of uneasiness that prompted me. It had occurred to me that perhaps I might feel more comfortable if I remained nearer to the front door, and I made my fire in one of the rooms on the ground floor. Now and this was an idiotic fantasy, I know, but if anything queer did happen, and I had to make a sudden bolt for it, well, I could get out quicker that way. I was on the second descent of the stairs as I faced the light from the open front door, as I heard somewhere in the back of my mind the theme from Resident Evil playing softly somewhere in my mind, that I suddenly noticed something that pulled me up with a decided start. Running up the center of the staircase, and quite fresh in the thick dust, was a broad, broken sort of track, exactly as though someone had recently trailed up an empty sack or something of that nature. From the foot of the staircase, I traced this track in the dust across the hall to a spot immediately below an old moth-eaten coat that hung from one of a row of coat pegs on the opposite wall. And then I saw that similar tracks traversed the hall in various directions, some terminating before the doors on either side, others leading past the foot of the stairs to the rear regions of the house, but all seeming to radiate from the same point below the coat pegs. And the queerest thing of all, my friends, the queerest thing of all about it was that of footprints other than my own, there was none. Uneasiness once more assailed me. The house appeared to be uninhabited, and yet plainly someone or something had recently been in the place. Who or what was the question, questioning the creature that had made those strange tracks to and from the old coat? Was it some half-witted vagrant, possibly trailing draperies obliterating their own footprints? I had a closer look at the old garment. It was a military greatcoat of ancient pattern with one or two tarnished silver buttons that still attached to it. It had evidently seen much service. Turning around on its peg with a gingerly finger and thumb, I discovered that just below the left shoulder there was a round hole as big as a penny, surrounded by an area of scorched and stained cloth, as though a heavy pistol had been fired into it at point-blank range. If a pistol bullet had indeed made that hole, well, then obviously the old coat at one period of its existence had clothed a dead man. A sudden repugnance for the thing overcame me. With a slight shudder, I let go of it. Now, it may have been fancy or may not, but all at once it seemed to me that there was more than an odor of mold and rotting cloth emanating from the thing, that there was a taint of putrefying flesh and bone, a taint of animal corruption, faint but unmistakable. I could sniff it in the air, and with it something less definable but no less real, a sort of sixth sense, feeling that the whole atmosphere of the place was slowly becoming charged with evil emanations from a black and shameful past. With an effort, I pulled myself together. After all, what was there to be scared about? I had no need to fear human marauders, for in my hip pocket I carried a small but serviceable automatic, and as for ghosts, well, if such existed, they didn't usually walk in the daytime. The place certainly felt creepy, and I shouldn't have cared to spend the night there. But it would be ridiculous to allow mere idle fancy to drive me out again into that beastly rain before I'd made myself badly needed hot drink and mended my bicycle. Therefore, I opened the door nearest to me. I entered a smallish room that apparently had once been used as a study. The fireplace was on the side opposite to the door, and the wide ancient grate was still choked with the ashes of the last log consumed there. I picked up the poker, a cumbersome old thing with a knob as big as an orange, and raked out the ashes, and laid my sticks in approved Boy Scout fashion. The wood was damp, and after I'd used half my matches, refused to do more than smolder, whilst a backdraft from the chimney filled the room with smoke. In desperation, I went down on my hands and knees, and I tried to rouse those embers into a flame by blowing on them, and in the middle of this irksome operation, I was startled by a sound of movement in the hallway. A single soft flop, as though someone had flung down a garment. I was on my feet in a flash, listening with every nerve. A taut, no further sound came. An automatic in hand, I tiptoed to the door. There was nothing in the hall, nothing to be heard at all, save the steady swish of the rain outside. But from a spot on the floor, directly below that old coat, the dust was rising in a little eddying cloud, as though it had just been disturbed. Pah! A rat, I told myself, and I went back to my task. More vigorous blowing on the embers, more raking and poking, more striking of matches, and in the midst of it again there came that curious noise. Not very loud, but plain and unmistakable. Once more I went into the hall. Once more, except for another little cloud of dust rising from precisely the same spot as before, there was nothing to be seen. Yes, but that sixth sense warning of imminent danger was becoming more insistent. I had the feeling now that I was no longer alone in the old empty hall, that some unclean, invisible presence was lurking there, tainting the very air with its foulness. It's no use, I said to myself. I may be a nervous fool, but I can't stand any more of this. I'll collect my traps and clear out whilst the going's good. With this commentary to myself, I went back into the room, keeping a nervous eye cocked on the door, began with a rather panicky haste to repack my haversack, and just as I was in the act of tightening the last strap, there came from the hall a low, evil chuckle, followed by the sound of stealthy movement. I whipped out my weapon. I stood where I was in the middle of the floor, facing the door, with my blood turning to ice. Through the chink between the door hinges, I saw a shadow pass. Then the door creaked a little, slowly began to open, and round the door came the coat. The coat, as God is above me, stood upright in the doorway, swaying a little as though uncertain of its balance, collar and shoulders extended as though by an invisible wearer. The old musty coat I had seen hanging in the hall. For a space that seemed an eternity, I stood like a man of stone, facing the thing as it seemed to pause on the threshold. A dreadful sort of hypnotism held me rooted to the spot on which I stood, a hypnotism that completely paralyzed my body and caused the pistol to slip nerveless from my fingers, and yet left my brain clear. Mingled with my frozen terror was a feeling of deadly nausea. I knew that I was in the presence of a resident, ultimate evil, that the very aura of the hell-engendered thing reared there in the doorway was contamination, that its actual touch would mean not only the instant destruction of my body, but the everlasting damnation of my very soul. Now, it was coming into the room with an indescribable bobbing sort of motion, the empty leaves jerking grotesquely at its sides, the skirts flopping and trailing in the dust, slowly coming towards me, and step by step, with my bulging eyes riveted in awful fascination on the thing I was recoiling before it. Step by step, with the rigid, unconscious movement of an automaton, I drew back until I was brought up with my back pressed into the fireplace and could retreat no further. And still, with deadly malevolent purpose, the thing crept towards me. The empty sleeves were rising and shakily reaching out towards my throat. In another moment they would touch me. And then I knew with the most awful and dreadful certainty that my reason would snap. A coherent thought somehow came into my burning brain, something that I had read or heard of long ago. The power of the holy sign against the forces of evil. With a desperate effort, I stretched out a palsied hand, and I made the sign of the cross. And in that instant, my other hand, scrabbling frenziedly at the wall behind me, came into contact with something cold and hard and round. It was the knob of the old iron-heavy poker. The touch of the cold iron seemed to give me the instant repossession of my faculties. With lightning swiftness, I swung up the iron poker and struck with all my force at the nightmare horror before me. And lo, on the instant, the thing collapsed. Became an old coat. Nothing more. Lying there in a heap at my feet. And yet, on my oath, as I cleared the hellish thing in a flying leap and I fled from the room, I saw it, out of the tail of my eye, gathering itself together and making shape, as it were, to scramble after me. Once outside that accursed house, I ran as never man ran before, and I remember nothing more until I found myself half fainting before the door of a little inn. Bring wine in the name of God, I cried, staggering inside. Wine was brought to me, and a little wondering group stood around me while I drank. I tried to explain to them in my bad French. They continued to regard me with puzzled looks. At length a look of understanding came into the landlord's face. Mon Dieu, he gasped. Is it possible the monsieur has been in that place? Quick, Juliette, monsieur, he will need another bottle of wine. Later, I got something of the story from the landlord, though he was by no means eager to tell it. The deserted house had once been occupied by a retired officer of the First Napoleon's army, a semi-madman with a strain of the African blood in him. Judging from the landlord's story, he must have been one of the worst men God ever allowed to walk this earth. Most certainly, monsieur. He was a bad man, that one. He killed his wife and tortured every living thing he could lay hands upon. Even, it is said, his own daughters. In the end, one of them shot him in the back. The old chateau has an evil name. Ha! Monsieur, if you offered me 1,000,000 francs, mon Dieu, you would not get one of our country folk to go anywhere near that place. Now, as I said at the beginning of this story, I know that the other fellows of the office are inclined as it is to regard me as being a bit odd. So I haven't told any of them this story. In fact, I've told no one until tonight when I've told you. Nevertheless, it's perfectly true. My brand new bicycle and touring traps are probably still lying where I left them in the hall of that devil-ridden chateau. Anybody here who cares to collect them may keep them. Thank you very much. That's the coat from A.E.D. Smith. Until the early spring of 1939, I had never entered a reputedly haunted house, nor had ever met anyone who had. It all came about in a rather rambling sort of way, starting off with 12 or 15 of us driving down to Phipps Cove on a Saturday afternoon to spend the weekend with the Bradley Merrills. Oh, my God, how long ago that seems now. I had looked forward to a truly delightful weekend. I already knew, or at least was acquainted with, several of the other guests. Bob Mansfield, who paints for art's sake but designs fanciful and expensive apartments for the very wealthy for a living. Rebikoff, who has a marionette show. Gladys Sugden, the caustic, hoydenish novelist. And I don't know, 3 or 4 others. Merrill, by the way, Bradley Merrill, was and still is an illustrator. The afternoon was very casual and delightful. We played a sort of haphazard tennis on the lawn. We swam, those of us with polar bear instincts, in the freezing surf. We just talked, wandered about. Dinner was at 7 in a high-ceilinged, creamy white room with a huge black marble fireplace at one end in which a driftwood fire snapped, showering multicolored sparks against the heavy screen. The meal was leisurely. It was already dark outside as we finally assembled in the big, gracious living room for brandies and highballs. As usual, Bradley and Elsa had prepared no set routine for the evening. Vladimir Lesov started things off by wandering over to the Chickering and treating us to an impromptu concert. And then Clevador put on some of his magic, and following Clevador, we danced. The evening passed swiftly.
It was with incredulous surprise that I saw that Bradley glanced at the tall walnut clock in the hall, dramatically raise his hand. In 10 seconds, my pious friends, and I hope not too drunken companions, it will be exactly midnight, Eastern Standard Time. He had hardly finished speaking when the old clock whirred and rasped and bonged out 12 slow strokes. We all listened gravely. And immediately the brazen clangor had ceased. Gladys Sugden made the inevitable suggestion. A ghost story! Who will tell us a ghost story? Dryly, Bob Mansfield applied the sophisticated squelch. Why, Gladys, you of all people, we don't have to do anything as tame as that. Not when there's a haunted house right here at the cove. Yes, I had heard of that haunted house, a few miles distant along the shore road. It had stood empty for half a century or more. It was popularly supposed to have been built by Jeremiah Phipps, one of New England's more successful privateersmen, or, too frequently, pirates. Gladys, with just a trifle too much eagerness, so it seemed to me, fell in with the idea. Oh, perfect! What could be better for a Saturday night hijinks? I've always had a sneaking longing to go inside that house. Let's snoop over there tonight. There's a lovely moon. Well, we took a vote. The ayes won, of course, overwhelmingly. I think I suspected trickery from the very start. As a matter of fact, I learned afterward that I was right, and who the ringleaders were. Bradley, Bob Mansfield, and a meek-looking little cartoonist named Gregory. Oh, of course, Gladys was in on it, too. My certainty that we were in for some ghostly amateur theatricals was clinched when I noticed, as we were getting ready to leave the house, that Mansfield and Gregory had unobtrusively disappeared. I suspected that they were to be the ghosts of the evening. Well, at any rate, we piled into 3 or 4 cars. We drove the 6 or 7 miles to the Phipps mansion. In the moonlight, it looked even more ancient, more forbidding than in the daylight, with its gaunt exterior chimneys and its deeply recessed, many-paned windows. And I swore I saw a raccoon disappear around the dark back corner. As we swarmed toward its black pile, I looked in the shadows cast by the house, by the trees, for Mansfield's car. But there were 100 pools of inky shadows where a car could be hidden. Bradley did not have to unlock or force the door. It was already unlocked and opened easily. That seemed significant to me. I was sure now than ever that someone had gone ahead and was already hidden inside. When we were all in the hallway, Bradley closed the door behind us with a creaking of ponderous hinges, a rusty click of the wrought iron latch, and turned on a flashlight. He led the way, with an assurance that led me to believe that he had been there before, into a large room at the front of the house. I glimpsed briefly a long staircase leading up into the darkness at the end of the hallway. I sensed, rather than saw, the ornate moldings surmounting cold, vault-like spaces, a shrouding of heavy, fine dust over everything. I noticed, too, that Bradley had been very careful to keep the beam of his flashlight turned upward until we were all inside that huge parlor, and I felt sure he had done that to keep us from noticing the fresh footprints of Mansfield and Gregory in the dust underfoot, no doubt. Except for the light from the flashlight, the parlor was almost totally dark. Heavy wooden shutters over the windows permitted no moonlight to enter, except through 2 or 3 narrow cracks in the warped panels. The light was too faint to reveal more than the presence and position of the people in the room, and certainly was not strong enough to permit us to identify each other. Well, Brad, we're here, Gladys Sugden chirped perkily. Bring on your ghosts, or shall we go looking for them? Who's afraid of the big bad ghosts anyway? Bradley parried that one. Now, this is supposed to be a haunted house, isn't it, Gladys? Can't a ghost appear in this room as well as upstairs or in the cellar? I, for one, am staying right here and waiting for whatever happens. I don't want any rotten floors collapsing under me. This place isn't any palace of mirth, after all. I suspected he was afraid that we might stumble onto his ghosts before they had a chance to get into their phosphorus paint. Bradley won his point. He turned off the flashlight. To make it seem more realistic, he said. And we waited. I don't know just what happened, or what I expected to happen. I admit the uncertainty of waiting made me feel creepy there in the dark, and it must have affected the others who did not suspect any funny business much more powerfully.
an unreality in the whole adventure. There was unreality in the shadowy vagueness of our figures. There was unreality in the cold stillness of the long shuttered room. I caught myself wondering how a bunch of supposedly intelligent adults could act so downright foolish. Then I began to notice the light. At first it was just the faintest, vaguest glow, hardly more than a lessening of the total darkness beyond the open hallway door. I seemed to feel the outlines of the hallway growing into visibility without actually seeing them as yet, limed in a sort of purplish absence of complete darkness. A strange light was so vague that it might have almost been imagined. But the sudden creeping, shriveling down my spine was real enough. The others felt it too. I could sense they were shrinking away from that doorway. The faint light grew stronger, and the tension gripped me with the certainty that something was creeping silently down that staircase into the hall, invisible to me as yet from where I stood. I acknowledged unwillingly that Bradley was putting on his show with utter artistry. No hollow groans, no clanking chains, none of those too theatrical effects that defeat their own purpose. It was the very absence of effect that left our imaginations unhampered and built up an eerie apprehension in us. I wondered how Bradley would produce his ghosts without spoiling the effect. Perhaps he didn't intend to actually produce them at all. Perhaps he intended to get his effect in some other, less obvious way. I don't know how long we stood there in that empty room. It may have been several minutes, while no person spoke or changed position, while we strained our eyes, trying to see in the light that was hardly less than blackness. The light, I told myself with admiration of my own cleverness, that must be made by slowly uncovering a stained glass window, letting the moonlight in. Once or twice I heard someone's breathing sharply indrawn, and then released in a half gasp. And then I saw the figures, standing in the unearthly purplish gloom. Again a queer flash of unwilling approbation swept me. Those figures were not skeletoned in phosphorus paint or anything as crude as that. They were merely vague blotches in human shape, standing silently in the almost non-existent visibility in the hallway. I have wondered since just how few of us did not at that moment really believe that they were ghosts. Gradually then, in much the same manner as indirect lighting is controlled, the purplish glow began to brighten. With the increase in illumination, I began to feel that I recognized those two motionless figures. The one on the right, tall, slightly stooped, was certainly Mansfield. The dark blotch hiding below the lower part of his face was a false beard. Those baggy trousers, that hinting of a cutlass at the waist, were all parts of the pirate costume Bradley had considered most appropriate for the occasion. The other fellow standing to the left was slightly behind Mansfield was Gregory, all right. He put a great daub of paint on his breast to simulate blood, apparently, and he kept his hands folded over it. The two figures neither moved nor spoke. The light was too dim for me to distinguish details of their features, and as it became slightly stronger, something of a nervous shock swept over me as I sensed, rather than saw, that their lips were moving, as though they were trying to speak, that their hands were out thrust towards us, as though warning us back. It was an effect, undeniably. Bradley was putting his show over well after all. Splitting that silence, a woman screamed a high-pitched, keening note. In an instant, the hypnotic tension that had gripped us all was broken. Bradley cursed and flipped on the flashlight. With a quick rushing of anxious footsteps, Gladys Slugden was at the side of the girl who was sobbing violently. Bradley's voice boomed out reassuringly. "All right, that's enough, that's enough. It's just been a joke, folks. For God's sakes, make her understand it's just a joke, Gladys. A joke that wasn't in very good taste. I'm sorry, folks, I'm sorry." Bradley swung the light on the two figures standing in the doorway. "All right, Bob, Gregory, fun's fun. A joke's a joke. Enough's enough. Come on in, break it up, break it up." Yes, but the two figures did not move. They still stood there, holding their hands outstretched towards us, their lips moving. Then Bradley swore, viciously, horribly, without mirth. "You pig-headed fools! Can't you see they're scaring one of the girls half to death? Get in here and take off that junk." And still, the figures stood there motionless, tableau-esque. I think that we were all beginning to be afraid that they had entered so fully into the spirit of the deception that they were, temporarily crazed. Even Bradley had no knowledge of what they might do next. What further macabre jest they might have planned as unknown to him as to us. Curiously, though I was watching them with a single-minded attention, I noticed other things, too. I noticed with a sort of detached interest that there really was, as I had suspected, a stained glass window high above the staircase. A window which so dispelled that unearthly glow over the hallway, now stronger, now weaker as the moon was bright or obscured by clouds. Almost stealthily, Bradley kept edging forward. He was within 6 feet of Mansfield, his torch blindingly in Mansfield's face. I was only a pace or two behind, and I could see Mansfield's face clearly. There was an uncanny fixity in his gaze that gave me, despite myself, a feeling of discomfort that was very close to horror. The thought came to me abruptly. Is this damned place really haunted after all? Have these fellows seen something that drove them out of their mind? Is it a haven for ghosts? Bradley cursed again sharply. The unexpected brutal sound jarred against my eardrums with the force of an explosion. With a curse, Bradley leaped forward. His right hand, furiously outstretched, clutched at Mansfield. Mansfield and Bradley glided back, swiftly, yet effortlessly. The sudden, relatively violent motion of all three reminded me bizarrely of the quick shifting of scenes thrown on a screen by an old-fashioned magic lantern. Then the tableau was resumed. But now Bradley was standing in the center of the hallway, holding his right hand out before him, looking at it with a strange intentness. Mansfield and Gregory had halted at the foot of the staircase, their hands still outthrust, thrusting us back. Bradley spoke like a drunken person. "Bob? Bob?" His shoulders hunched. He shuffled doggedly, unsteadily forward. As he approached Mansfield and Gregory and turned and leaped up the staircase, the light from the flashlight shining full on the staircase, on the wall above and behind them. Then that thing happened, which is beyond normal human experience. Instantaneously, suddenly as a bolt of lightning, two strangers were also there at the top of the staircase. Two sun-swathed, lithe-muscled men with flashing teeth beneath heavy mustaches, with the flint of gold in their ears and the glitter of cutlasses in their hands. It was like a silent motion picture running at top speed. There was no sound, only an utter violence of motion. There should have been the thudding of bare feet on the staircase, but I heard no such sound. There should have been the heavy panting of those men and the harsh burst of their curses, but I heard only silence. Mansfield and Gregory plunged upward to the head of the staircase. Mansfield was slightly in the lead. His right arm swung up in a chopping blow that seemed to go through one of those men as though through a mirage. His body, tense to meet resistance that was not there, spun crazily around and plunged over the low balustrade. I listened for the crash of his fall and heard no sound. I saw Gregory catapult against the other stranger, hurtle through that man in the instant of a cutlass flash, and disappear beyond my range of vision on the staircase landing above. Abruptly, no one was there. No one at all. The head of the staircase gaped down at us, blank, barren, deserted. I heard Gladys Sugden screaming. She was trying to call Mansfield's name, but the sounds that came from her lips were unrecognizable. My body was trembling violently, and spasms of hot and cold swept over me. I think that horror gripped us all then, like a mighty fist, squeezed us until we were incapable of thought, until we could only stand there and feel it engulfing us in beating waves. I knew then that those two strangers were the ghosts, the true ghosts of old Jeremiah Phipps's mansion. Now, what in the name of the Almighty had we just seen reenacted? The experience through which Mansfield and Gregory had passed earlier in the evening. An experience so mind-shattering that it had driven them mad? Where were they? "Bradley!" My voice, almost a whispered rattle. "Where are they? Mansfield and Gregory! Where are they?" Bradley looked at me, his eyes enormous, his lips trembling. "Where are they?" he repeated slowly. He moved his hands in an odd, uncontrolled way, helplessly. While he stared at me, I took the flashlight from him. Somehow I started up the staircase, and Bradley followed. At the top, on the landing where, like uplifted arms, narrower flights continued upward into gloom, we halted. There, beneath the stained glass window, huddled far back against the wall and hidden from view from below by the pitch of the staircase, lay the twisted body of a man, fallen as if death had come as he had catapulted across the landing from the staircase below. Bradley moaned, and I felt the balustrade shudder as he sagged heavily against it. I was trembling uncontrollably. The body, the twisted body laying on the ground, was the body of Gregory. Somehow, we found the courage after a moment to look down. With photographic clarity, our eyes saw, and our numbed minds, I recorded automatically, the staring horror in Gregory's wide-open glazing eyes, the smear of crimson paint over his heart. Without speaking, we turned away and staggered down that staircase. As though urged by a fate beyond human capacity to resist, I turned the flashlight beam into the dark recesses behind that staircase, beneath the balustrade across which Mansfield had seemed to plunge. Without surprise, I saw that Mansfield's body was there, spread-eagled as though he had put out his arms to break the fall. Crushed against the naked floor, his neck was broken. I remember little else of what happened that night. I do not know if among us there were hysterical outbursts or a more terrible controlled silence. I do not remember how or when we left that house. Memory grows clearer with the next day. The beginnings of the grinding police investigation, the certainty with which the police believed we had trumped up a fantastic story to cover a double murder in our fast set, the newspaper headlines said. It was a long time before that night in the old Phipps house was forgotten by the public. It was forgotten at last. For years it remained as no more than an area of nightmare in the recesses of my own memory. Until last summer, when the old house was finally torn down to save taxes, somebody told me. About that time I chanced to meet Bradley in town one day. He looked more distinguished than ever with his prematurely white hair, and he looked at my graying temples with a wry understanding. They're either too young or too old, he said softly, a phrase from the hit song, and made a quick, angry gesture with his right hand. We're too old, and that's that. How about lunch, man? In the quiet, around the corner off the Avenue restaurant to which he took me, he told me those things which drew all the threads together, or wrote finis to the story of the Phipps mansion. I couldn't stay away. After they started to raise that house, he said slowly, quietly, I went down there almost every day, you know. I knew they'd find something, call it a premonition, intuition, what you will. And I knew they would find something, some explanation in that staircase. I watched them take up the flooring on that landing, rip up the rubble, the stone, the mortar beneath. That house was built to endure. Old Phipps, when he built it, was ready to settle down all right. But first he had to get rid of his past. He must have had a couple of men who wanted to stay on shore with him, even though he'd split his bloody plunder with them and with his crew. But old Phipps knew that those two fellows we saw at the top of that staircase weren't the kind he wanted around him in his respectability. This must have been what happened. When the masons had just finished filling in that staircase, old Phipps just bashed in the heads of those two sailors of his, and he dumped the bodies in the mortar and covered them up. They found the skeletons just the other day, you know. I picked up my coffee. I put it down again. Yeah. I read in the paper about the gold earrings and the cutlasses they dug up with those skeletons. Bradley looked at me thoughtfully. You know, funny about those cutlasses. Remember that Gregory's body was unmarked and he died of heart failure? I picked up my cup again. Once again, I put it down. Gregory Mansfield, I whispered. Yeah. What a horrible way to die. Gotta die, but such a horrible way to die. Think of it. They went up that staircase the second time after they'd already seen the ghosts. That was a reenactment, wasn't it, Bradley? We could have saved them then. They were crazy with fear, but not crazy enough not to try to yarn us. We should have knocked them down, tied them up, anything, only we should have saved them somehow. Slowly Bradley shook his head. A curious, faraway look, a look of one who gazed into the depths of the infinite, came into his eyes. No, 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 my friend, we could not have saved them. It was too late for that. For they were already dead when we saw them in that. Oh, yeah, it was a reenactment. They were dead before we even entered that house. We saw not 2, but 4 ghosts that night. When I tried to grasp Manfield there in that hallway, my hand went through him as though through nothingness. And nothingness was cold and empty and terrible as a black dead space beyond the farthest stars. So A Dark Mummery by Thorpe McCluskey.